Everything is going to be fine. Please remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. We'll be through this turbulence shortly.
We're losing altitude fast. Mayday!
Please, dear God, save us.
Hail Mary, full of grace.
Please bring them home safely. Let them be found. Have mercy on Flight 2501 and all aboard.
Sir, still nothing on the active sonar.
Are we certain about the coordinates? We have 58 souls depending on us.
You've always heard stories of a single missing person, someone who wandered into the woods and never returned, a sailor lost at sea, a traveler whose name slowly fades from memory. These are the tragedies we understand, the ones that become footnotes in newspapers and cautionary tales for those left behind. But the story you are about to hear is not like those. This is not the disappearance of one man or woman, nor even a small group. This is something far bigger, far more unsettling. An entire aircraft, a whole world of people swallowed by the night. 58 human lives vanished in a single moment, and to this day, the sky has never returned them. On June 23, 1950, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 was scheduled to cross the country from New York to Seattle with a planned stop in Minneapolis. It was a long flight, but a familiar one, connecting the busy pace of the East Coast to the growing energy of the Pacific Northwest. Passengers boarded expecting a straightforward journey, a few hours in the air, a stopover, then onward to homes, families, and futures waiting on the other side. No one imagined that this particular night, this particular flight, would be their last. The aircraft chosen for the journey was a Douglas DC-4, a trusted workhorse of post-war aviation. 4 propeller engines, a sturdy frame, and a reputation for reliability had made it one of America's most dependable long-distance airliners. Crews respected it, airlines promoted it, and passengers felt safe inside it. On that night in 1950, Flight 2501 carried 55 passengers and 3 crew members, each settling into their seats as the plane began its climb westward. Above them stretched a quiet sky, still untouched by the storm forming hundreds of miles ahead. The early hours of the flight passed without incident. The engines hummed steadily, carrying the DC-4 over the lights of the eastern cities and into the dark expanse of the Midwest. But across Lake Michigan, an immense weather system was gathering strength, a violent, unpredictable mass of wind, rain, and electrical energy. Storms over the Great Lakes had always been notorious, capable of transforming calm air into treacherous turbulence in minutes. And on this night, Lake Michigan was preparing one of its most dangerous moods. As Flight 2501 approached the lake's eastern edge, the world below shifted. Clouds thickened into walls of darkness. Waves on the lake churned violently beneath the wind. Lightning flickered deep inside massive towers of storm clouds, briefly illuminating the sky before disappearing again into pitch-black night. The peaceful rhythm of the flight began to change as turbulence shook the cabin. The passengers could not have known then that they were flying toward a turning point in aviation history, a moment where every assumption about safety, control, and certainty would collapse into silence. At 11:13 p.m., the cockpit crew made a routine but crucial radio transmission. Captain Robert Lind reported worsening conditions and requested permission to descend from 3,500 feet to 2,500 feet. The storm was escalating far more aggressively than forecasted, and lower altitude might offer smoother air. Turbulence was becoming severe, the winds were erratic, the DC-4 was being pushed hard by forces no aircraft of that era was designed to withstand comfortably. But air traffic control could not grant the request. Another aircraft was flying below them, occupying the airspace the DC-4 needed. The skies were crowded that night, and the storm was making an already complex situation even more difficult. Captain Lind acknowledged the denial. He continued forward, holding altitude, flying into a storm that was tightening around the plane with every passing minute. The next moments would become among the most scrutinized in American aviation history. As the flight pressed deeper into the storm, the radio grew unstable. Messages crackled, transmission strength faded. The storm's interference distorted every sound. Investigators would later describe the final communication as incomplete, barely understandable, a sign that the aircraft was still airborne but struggling. What happened afterward remains unknown. Somewhere over the pitch-black waters of Lake Michigan, Flight 2501 disappeared from the radar screens of history. There was no distress call, no emergency message, no attempt to describe what was happening on board. Just silence. Silence so complete, so absolute, that it seemed impossible. Planes did not simply vanish, not in 1950, not with experienced pilots and reliable engineering. Yet Flight 2501 did. Like a candle instantly snuffed out, it was gone. Below the aircraft, the storm raged with unimaginable force. Winds whipped across the lake, pushing waves into chaotic formations. Lightning struck in jagged bursts. Rain fell so heavily that visibility dropped to nothing. Whatever occurred in the air above, the water beneath knew, and whatever the lake knew, it kept. In the hours that followed, confusion spread across the aviation network. Controllers attempted to reach the flight again and again. Other aircraft nearby listened for signals. Nothing came. No beacon, no response, no echo of the pilot's voice. The DC-4 had fallen off the grid entirely, leaving behind a void that grew larger with every minute of silence. By morning, news of the disappearance began to circulate. Newspapers prepared early editions with cautious headlines. Aviation officials mobilized search teams. Families across the country waited for word, holding on to hope in the same fragile way one holds on to a photograph in the dark, afraid to lose it, afraid to look too closely. For those families, the hours felt endless. They imagined mechanical failure, flight delays, forced landings, anything but the unthinkable. Air travel, after all, was supposed to represent progress. It was supposed to be safe. The idea that a large commercial airliner could simply vanish defied everything people believed about modern technology. Yet, as daylight stretched across the surface of Lake Michigan, the truth began to emerge in fragments. A floating cushion, a small piece of metal, a scrap of fabric. Evidence that Flight 2501 had not simply gone off course. Something catastrophic had occurred, violent, immediate, and final. And still, the lake held the real answers beneath its surface. Flight 2501's disappearance would become one of the most haunting mysteries in American aviation. It marked the first time the nation truly grappled with the idea that even large aircraft, even those flown by skilled crews, could vanish without a trace. No wreckage was recovered in those first desperate hours. No fuselage, no wings, no engines, no bodies, only debris scattered across a storm-battered shoreline. In the decades that followed, investigators, historians, divers, and grieving families would all return to the same haunting truth. The exact fate of Flight 2501 remains unknown, and perhaps even more unsettling, its final resting place has never been found. The storm swallowed the aircraft. The lake hid it. Time sealed the mystery. Tonight, we begin the journey into what happened, the people aboard, the flight itself, the search that spanned generations, and the enduring question that refuses to fade. How does a plane full of human beings vanish into the night without leaving the world a single answer.
In 1950, America stood at a crossroads between two eras, the shadow of war fading behind it and the bright promise of technological progress stretching ahead. The nation was rebuilding itself with an energy that touched every part of daily life. New highways connected distant towns, television sets flickered in living rooms for the first time, and the idea of modern convenience was becoming a part of the American identity. Among the greatest symbols of this new era was air travel. The sky, once reserved for military necessity and daring pioneers, had become a pathway for ordinary citizens. Flight represented not only freedom of movement, but the confidence of a country stepping boldly into the future. Airlines advertised glamour and reliability. Posters showed sleek aircraft cruising above white clouds, stewardesses smiling in tailored uniforms, families boarding planes with excitement and trust. For many, flying felt like stepping into a world that had previously existed only in imagination, a world where distance shrank and time bent to human will. The post-war boom encouraged this belief. With veterans returning home, a growing middle class, and industry flourishing, America felt stronger, safer, and more optimistic than ever before. This was the world in which Northwest Orient Airlines operated. It was a respected carrier, serving major national routes, connecting cities from coast to coast. Flight 2501 was one of hundreds of journeys crossing the continent at that time, part of a vast network that represented confidence in technology and faith in human progress. People believed in airplanes. They believed in the pilots who flew them, the engineers who built them, the systems that guided them. In an age hungry for innovation, the sky no longer felt like a place of danger. It felt like a destination. Families traveling in 1950 carried this sense of wonder with them. Stepping on board a plane was an event, not just a mode of transportation. Some dressed in their best clothes for the journey, treating it like a special occasion. Children pressed their faces against the windows, marveling at the view of the earth shrinking below. Businessmen carried briefcases filled with promise, deals to be made, partnerships to expand. Soldiers traveling between assignments felt the strange blend of duty and excitement that came from crossing states in hours rather than days. Flying was both practical and symbolic. But beneath the optimism lay a truth that would soon become impossible to ignore. Aviation was still young. Technology was advancing rapidly, but it had not yet reached the precision, automation, or weather prediction capabilities that define modern flight. Pilots navigated using radio beacons, visual cues, and experience hardened by challenging conditions. Weather forecasting relied on scattered data points rather than comprehensive satellite imaging. Communication systems lacked the stability and clarity we take for granted today. And despite the strength of aircraft like the Douglas DC-4, the skies were not yet tamed by human ambition. Still, in the summer of 1950, most Americans trusted that the risks of flying were well understood and well managed. Planes had crossed oceans, they had flown through storms, they had carried millions safely from one point to another. Flight 2501, in that context, appeared entirely ordinary. It was scheduled to take off from New York and travel to Seattle with a single stop in Minneapolis. The passengers had no reason to think of danger. They boarded expecting a smooth journey across the country. At airports across America, the excitement of flying was everywhere. Boarding gates filled with the sound of luggage wheels and announcements over loudspeakers. Mechanics moved between aircraft, conducting checks with the practiced rhythm of those who understood the seriousness of their work. Flight crews reviewed navigation charts and weather reports, discussing routes through the Midwest as though discussing familiar roads. Air travel felt controlled, predictable, an extension of American efficiency and post-war confidence. Against this backdrop of optimism, the disappearance of Flight 2501 struck with a force the nation was unprepared for. The idea that a commercial plane could simply vanish, not crash openly, not leave a trail of wreckage, but disappear, felt unthinkable. People struggled to understand it. Families demanded answers that no one could provide. Newspapers printed headlines that felt surreal. How could an airplane, built with the most advanced technology of its time, carrying 58 souls, vanish into the night without a single clear trace? The shock rippled through communities far beyond those directly affected. For many Americans, the disappearance was their first confrontation with the unsettling truth that aviation, despite its promise, still carried mysteries. It was a reminder that nature could overpower human design, that storms could hide secrets beneath their violence, and that the sky, so vast and open, could swallow things whole. The timing of the event amplified its impact. In the early years of commercial aviation, people viewed airplanes as marvels of engineering, symbols of hope, and emblems of national progress. Passengers often chose to fly because it represented something new, something modern, something exciting. But after June 23, 1950, excitement gave way to unease. The disappearance of Flight 2501 was not just an aviation incident, it was a moment that shifted public perception. It challenged the belief that technology could conquer every frontier. It reminded the nation that progress always comes with risk, and that sometimes even the most sophisticated machines can encounter forces beyond their capacity to endure. News reports from that period revealed the emotional impact across the country. Articles described concerned families gathering by telephones, waiting for updates that never came. Crowds formed outside Northwest Orient offices, hoping for information. Radio broadcasts repeated the same stark message. A plane over Lake Michigan had vanished, and no one knew what had happened. The uncertainty was devastating. Without wreckage, without survivors, without a definitive cause, the disappearance felt like the erasure of an entire chapter of human life. It was not just a tragedy, it was an enigma. And that enigma struck at the heart of the era's optimism. If a modern aircraft could simply vanish, what else was possible? How far did the unknown stretch? What limits existed in the world people believed they were mastering? In the months that followed, airlines reevaluated flight paths and safety procedures. Meteorologists worked to improve storm prediction methods. The government began examining ways to strengthen communication systems and expand search capabilities over large bodies of water. Even so, the disappearance of Flight 2501 remained a grim reminder that progress often reveals new vulnerabilities. The story of America in 1950 is a story of ambition, a country pushing forward, trusting in science, machinery, and human capability. But it is also a story of humility. Flight 2501 reminded the nation that the world was still filled with mysteries, that technology had limits, and that even the brightest dreams could be interrupted by forces beyond control. As the investigation into the disappearance unfolded, Americans watched closely. They sought understanding in an event that defied understanding. And each passing day without answers deepened the sense that this tragedy was unlike anything the country had ever faced. The plane was gone. The passengers were gone. The lake was silent. And the nation, once so confident in its reach towards the skies, found itself staring into the unknown.
When Northwest Orient Flight 2501 lifted off from New York on June 23, 1950, it carried far more than luggage and paperwork. Inside that aircraft were lives, 58 of them, each with stories in motion, each heading somewhere with purpose, intention, and hope. Though history often reduces tragic events to numbers, the reality is always human. Every passenger had a name, a face, a destination, and loved ones waiting for them, and every crew member carried the responsibility of guiding those lives safely across the country. To understand the weight of what was lost that night, we must first understand who these people were. The list of those aboard Flight 2501 read like a cross-section of American life in 1950. Some were traveling for business, some for family, some returning home, and others beginning journeys that were supposed to continue far beyond that night. They were adults, children, elders, workers, soldiers, parents, and dreamers, each carrying the fragments of a life that would never reach its next chapter. Among the passengers were men returning from work trips in New York, eager to reunite with families in the Midwest. They carried briefcases stuffed with contracts, schedules, and hopes of productive weeks ahead. Several women on board were traveling to visit relatives, carrying gifts, packed suitcases, and letters tucked into bags, reminders of the connections that drew them across state lines. Some passengers were moving towards celebrations, birthday gatherings, family reunions, anniversaries that were waiting just a few hours beyond the horizon. There were children, too, some excited for the adventure of flying, others already asleep as the engines hummed beneath them. Their lives, still forming, had no awareness of danger, no sense that the night would hold something unimaginable. They were simply passengers, wrapped in the comfort of a routine journey, with parents watching over them and expecting nothing but a safe landing. The crew members aboard the aircraft were experienced professionals. Captain Robert Lind, responsible for the flight, carried years of aviation background with him. His role represented not only technical knowledge, but the trust of every person seated behind him. Alongside him were dedicated crew, whose training prepared them for the many challenges of flight: turbulence, passenger needs, navigation adjustments. Their task was to ensure safety and calm from takeoff to landing. On Flight 2501, they carried those duties into a storm no one could have fully predicted. Many passengers were military personnel, veterans of World War II, reservists, or active soldiers traveling between bases and assignments. Some wore plain clothes, others carried the quiet discipline of those accustomed to movement. Their presence reflected the era's transition between war and peace, a time when travel often bridged the gap between duty and home. They boarded with the same expectation as everyone else, that the journey would be steady, efficient, and uneventful. There were families on the plane too, mothers traveling with children, relatives accompanying one another for support, and individuals leaving behind loved ones who expected to see them again within hours. For these families, the flight represented continuity, a planned arrival, a familiar face stepping off an airplane, a reunion that would now never happen. One of the most striking truths about Flight 2501 is how ordinary the passenger list was. These were not celebrities or political figures. They were not people drawn to adventure or danger. They were everyday Americans living everyday lives, taking a mode of travel that felt increasingly normal in the years after the war. And it is this very ordinariness that makes their loss so profound. The people aboard that aircraft could have been anyone: neighbors, co-workers, family members, strangers crossing paths for a few hours in the sky. Letters found in luggage fragments later washed ashore revealed hints of who they were: notes between loved ones, business correspondence, receipts for meals purchased hours before takeoff. Personal effects that turned up on the shoreline days later were heartbreakingly intimate: a wallet containing a photograph, a child's shoe, a piece of a coat. These objects became the last physical evidence of lives interrupted, reminders of people who had expected to step back into their routines after the flight. For the families, the waiting began the moment communication with the aircraft went silent. They gathered near telephones, pacing living rooms, hoping for word of a forced landing or a delayed arrival. Some clung to the idea that the plane had diverted to another airport. Others prayed for the smallest sign of survival. But as hours passed and no answers came, hope began to fracture. The weight of uncertainty was almost unbearable. At first, families were told simply that the aircraft was overdue, then that it was missing. These phrases offered no clarity, only dread. In the absence of information, the imagination fills with possibility, and each one is more painful than the last. Parents worried for children, spouses feared the worst, friends stared at clocks as time eroded optimism. As search teams combed the lake, families clung to what little they knew of the passengers' final hours, that they had boarded the aircraft safely, that weather had deteriorated, and that sometime after 11 p.m. communication had ceased. But what happened after that remained a void into which grief poured endlessly. In some households, life paused completely. Meals went uneaten. Newspapers lay untouched except for the front page. Radios stayed on through the night, broadcasting updates, each one failing to bring the closure people needed. Other families began traveling toward the region of the lake, hoping their presence might somehow yield answers faster. The roads leading to Michigan filled with quiet desperation, cars carrying people who wanted only to know the truth of what had happened to their loved ones. In the days following the disappearance, reporters approached families gently, capturing stories of the passengers. Interviews revealed the emotional landscape left behind: a father awaiting his son, a wife expecting her husband to walk off the plane, children unaware of the enormity of what had occurred. The stories were deeply personal, deeply human, and heartbreaking in their simplicity. They emphasized that Flight 2501 was not a mystery of machinery alone. It was a tragedy of interrupted lives. Airlines kept passenger lists discreet out of respect, but news soon spread as more families came forward, seeking any detail that might offer comfort or meaning. Funerals without bodies were held. Vigils gathered communities together. Clergy offered spiritual consolation to families who struggled to find grounding in a situation that defied understanding. The sorrow rippled outward, touching co-workers, neighbors, acquaintances, anyone who had known even a single person aboard the plane. In moments like these, tragedy reshapes the world of those affected. An empty chair at a dinner table, a gift unopened on a birthday that would never arrive, the absence of voices in homes where laughter once echoed. These private losses remained long after public attention shifted elsewhere. The passengers of Flight 2501 were more than names on a manifest. They were people living through the rhythms of a transformative moment in history, people who trusted in the expanding horizons of American aviation, people who believed the sky would carry them safely to where they needed to be. Their disappearance, sudden and complete, stands as one of the most haunting reminders of how fragile those hopes can be. And yet, despite the tragedy, the memory of the passengers has endured. They exist in family stories, in preserved letters, in the fragments found on the shoreline, and in the ongoing efforts to understand what happened that night. 58 people boarded a flight expecting tomorrow. 58 people never arrived, and the world they left behind would never be the same.
By the time Flight 2501 approached the eastern edge of Lake Michigan, the world outside had changed entirely. What began as a clear night had transformed into an atmosphere so hostile, so violently unstable, that even seasoned pilots would feel its weight. Turbulence pulsed through the aircraft as towering storm clouds rose like dark mountains ahead. The lake below, though invisible in the darkness, churned with wind-driven waves that mirrored the chaos above. It was in this environment, unpredictable, unforgiving, and rapidly deteriorating, that Flight 2501 entered its final minutes. The Douglas DC-4 was built to endure difficult conditions, but this storm was not ordinary. The system developing over Lake Michigan that night was a sprawling, volatile mass of electrical activity, low pressure gradients, and powerful winds capable of shifting direction in seconds. Weather reports gathered later confirmed that the aircraft was flying into one of the largest and most intense storm formations in the region that month. Rain hammered the metal skin of the plane, thunder echoed through the clouds, and each tilt of the aircraft told a story of the forces pressing against it. Inside the cockpit, the crew managed the aircraft with practiced discipline. Instruments flickered under the strain of atmospheric interference. Visibility was nearly non-existent. The windshield offered little more than streaks of water illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning. The horizon was gone. The sky and lake merged into a single black void. This was flying by instruments alone, at a time when technology was far less advanced than it is today. At 11:13 p.m., the flight crew transmitted the request that would later become the pivotal detail in every investigation. They asked air traffic control for permission to descend from 3,500 feet to 2,500 feet. The reason was clear. The storm was too strong at the current altitude. Turbulence was intensifying, and downdrafts could slam the aircraft downward with tremendous force. Descending offered the possibility of smoother air, a chance to escape the worst of the storm's violence. But that request was denied. Another plane had been routed beneath them, leaving no safe separation in the already chaotic skies. As procedure dictated, Flight 2501 needed to remain at altitude. Captain Lind acknowledged the denial. No alarm was reported. No unusual tone suggested what the next minutes would bring. But the storm worsening around the aircraft left very little margin for error. Turbulence continued to grow, turning the flight into a struggle between human skill and the forces of nature. The DC-4 pressed forward. With each passing moment, the aircraft moved deeper into a corridor of atmospheric instability, one defined by sudden vertical wind shifts, electrical fields, and heavy precipitation. These conditions were not fully measurable in the 1950s. Pilots relied on training, instinct, and limited meteorological data to navigate through weather that modern systems would detect and avoid long before takeoff. Passengers seated in the cabin would have felt the shift, the unpredictable jolts of turbulence, the sensation of the plane lifting and dropping under invisible hands of wind, the low rumble of thunder vibrating through metal. All of this would have created an atmosphere of tension. For some, it might have felt like routine rough air. For others, something far more ominous. As the flight moved westward into the storm, the radio began to weaken. Atmospheric interference disrupted transmissions, making communication increasingly unreliable. Messages that normally traveled clearly now flickered, crackled, and faded. Investigators later described the final transmission as faint and partially unintelligible, a signal that the aircraft was still airborne, still moving forward, but under conditions that strained both machinery and crew. What happened next lies at the heart of one of American aviation's greatest mysteries. Sometime after 11:13 p.m., Flight 2501 ceased communication entirely. There was no signal of distress, no final report of altitude, no emergency declaration. The aircraft simply fell silent. In the world of aviation, silence is one of the most chilling indicators of crisis. Not because it reveals what happened, but because it reveals nothing at all. Several factors made communication nearly impossible in that storm: electrical interference, atmospheric static, and the sheer power of the weather system. Yet even under dire circumstances, most aircraft incidents provide some fragment of radio evidence: a hurried call, a broken message, a final attempt to reach help. Flight 2501 offered no such clue. Once the radio went silent, the plane continued on its path for some amount of time. How long remains unknown. Radar tracking in 1950 was limited, and aircraft over water at night were not monitored with the precision we expect today. Controllers on the ground waited for a scheduled position report. When none came, they attempted contact. Silence. They tried again. Silence. Finally, the realization began to take shape. Flight 2501 was no longer responding. As the aircraft crossed deeper over the lake, powerful downdrafts may have pushed it downward. Lightning may have flashed through the surrounding clouds, illuminating a world of water and wind for fractions of a second. Turbulence may have intensified beyond anything experienced earlier in the flight. Every factor created a storm environment capable of overwhelming even experienced crews. Inside the cockpit, the crew would have been focused entirely on maintaining control. Their training prepared them for severe weather, but the conditions that night approached extremes. Instruments could behave erratically in bursts of electrical activity. Winds could tilt the aircraft suddenly, and in complete darkness, without a visible horizon, spatial awareness depended entirely on gauges and instincts honed over years of flight experience. Though we do not know the exact sequence, investigators later concluded that some combination of weather and external forces caused the plane to lose altitude rapidly and irreversibly. Whether it was a sudden downdraft, violent wind shear, or a combination of factors, the aircraft's descent likely occurred within seconds. The storm masked every sound, every movement, and the lake below, restless and vast, offered no warning. When the descent began, the crew may have attempted corrective action, but in storms like this, recovery windows can be incredibly narrow. A few seconds can determine whether an aircraft regains stability or continues downward. In the case of Flight 2501, whatever occurred did not leave room for a message to be sent, nor time for systems to respond. The aircraft's impact with the water, though never witnessed directly, was understood from later findings to have been catastrophic. The violence of the storm, combined with the speed and angle of descent, would have caused the plane to break apart upon contact with the lake's surface. This theory was supported by the scattered nature of debris found in the days that followed, fragments rather than intact sections, items separated by miles of turbulent water. Many crashes leave behind fields of floating wreckage, black boxes broadcasting pings, or bodies recovered near the point of impact. Flight 2501 left almost nothing on the surface. The lake absorbed the aircraft instantly, pulling large sections into its depths. Mid-century aviation lacked underwater search technology capable of mapping lake floors or locating deep debris. And Lake Michigan itself, with its unpredictable currents and ever-shifting sands, became an active participant in hiding the truth. In its final minutes, Flight 2501 was caught between two forces, the relentless violence of a natural storm and the limitations of a time when pilots faced the sky without the assistance of modern weather radar, digital instruments, or automated systems. Those aboard had no way of knowing that they were flying into a moment of history that would remain unanswered for generations. And once the aircraft slipped beneath the surface of the lake, the storm continued on. Winds swept across the water. Waves erased evidence. The night regained its silence. By dawn, the world above had changed. The sun rose over Lake Michigan, casting light on waters that appeared calm again, concealing everything that had occurred just hours before. Flight 2501 was gone. No survivors, no fuselage, no clear explanation. Only the storm had witnessed the flight's final minutes.
And it offered no account. Morning arrived over Lake Michigan with a deceptive stillness. The storm that had shaken the night before was gone, leaving behind a sky that looked peaceful, almost gentle, as if unaware of the tragedy it had concealed only hours earlier. But beneath that quiet surface lay the first hints of the disaster that had unfolded in the darkness. When Northwest Orient Flight 2501 failed to arrive at its scheduled destination, concern quickly deepened into alarm. Overnight silence in aviation is unsettling enough, but silence after a storm as violent as the one that swept across Lake Michigan was a warning few could ignore. At airports and airline offices, telephones began to ring. Controllers attempted again and again to raise the aircraft. No response, no beacon, no sign of life. Within hours, the U.S. Coast Guard initiated the first stages of what would become one of the most urgent search operations in the region's history. Patrol boats were dispatched across the lake, scanning the horizon for anything that might indicate the fate of the missing airliner. Aircraft flew overhead, tracing potential flight paths, circling areas where the radar had last recorded the plane. But the lake, vast and indifferent,
offered nothing at first. No floating wreckage, no bodies, no signs of distress. Just open water stretching endlessly in every direction. It wasn't until later that morning that the first clue surfaced. An oil slick, thin, shimmering and fragile against the waves, but undeniably present. The discovery sent a ripple of dread through the search teams. Aircraft did not leave oil on the surface unless something catastrophic had occurred. Soon afterward, additional fragments began to appear. A single seat cushion, torn and waterlogged, floated toward the shoreline. Then a scrap of metal, small, twisted, and battered by impact. Even before official confirmation, the fragments told a story the families feared. Flight 2501 had come apart. The Coast Guard intensified their efforts. Boats moved into tighter grid formations, scanning every inch of the lake's surface. Pilots circling overhead peered through binoculars, searching for patterns, clusters, anything unusual. The atmosphere aboard these search vessels was tense, quiet, and heavy with the burden of possibility. Every object spotted on the waves, a piece of driftwood, a glint of metal, a shadow beneath the surface, demanded immediate attention. By midday, personal items began washing ashore on the beaches near South Haven, Michigan. These objects carried an emotional weight far greater than their physical size. A child's clothing, a purse, a scattered page from a travel itinerary, a shoe that once walked toward an airplane door. Each item represented an entire life, a person who had boarded Flight 2501, expecting to reach a destination that was now lost forever. Crowds began gathering on the beaches as news spread. Residents, fishermen, and volunteers joined the search from land, hoping they might find something, anything that could help investigators piece together the truth. The lake, however, gave up its clues slowly and painfully. Most of the fragments that appeared were small, isolated, and insufficient to reconstruct what had happened. There were no large sections of the fuselage, no wings, no engines, nothing substantial enough to indicate where the main body of the aircraft had gone. For the families, the first reports offered both confirmation and heartbreak. Confirmation that the aircraft had indeed been lost, and heartbreak in the form of the only tangible evidence of their loved ones, debris scattered along the lake's edge. Some families traveled to Michigan immediately, standing on the shoreline as search boats drifted across the water, hoping that answers might wash ashore in the form of something more definitive than fragments. As the Coast Guard expanded its search zone, it became clear that the storm had scattered debris widely. The waves, winds, and currents created by the night's chaos had dispersed the remains of the aircraft across miles of open water and several segments of shoreline. This complicated every attempt at determining the precise location of impact. Without a concentrated debris field, pinpointing the crash site was nearly impossible. The U.S. Navy soon joined the effort, bringing additional manpower and expertise. Sonar equipment, primitive by modern standards, was used to attempt to detect large objects underwater. Divers were prepared to descend into the lake if any substantial wreckage was located. But the depths of Lake Michigan presented a unique challenge. In some areas, the water plunged hundreds of feet, with currents strong enough to move debris along the lake bed like shifting dunes. Compounding the difficulty was the weather that had preceded the search. Storms do not merely create waves, they reshape the underwater landscape. Anything that sank during or shortly after the storm could become rapidly buried under layers of sand and sediment. Even large pieces of aircraft could be swallowed whole within hours by the lake. Searchers were battling not only distance and depth, but time itself. Amid the search operations, officials set up coordination centers to manage the flood of information. Reports from fishermen, lighthouse keepers, and residents were cataloged. Coast Guard logs recorded every object recovered, every sighting, every change in weather. The investigation grew with urgency by the hour, but so did the realization that the plane might never be found intact. On the ground, newspaper reporters and photographers arrived, documenting the unfolding tragedy with somber respect. Headlines across the country reflected the same growing fear. How does a modern airliner vanish so completely? The lack of immediate evidence baffled aviation specialists. Most crashes, even those involving storms, left debris fields easily identifiable on the surface, but Flight 2501 seemed to defy expectations. The fragments that were discovered were small and widely dispersed. There were no large sections of the fuselage, no wings, no engines, nothing substantial enough to indicate where the main body of the aircraft had gone. The discovery of personal items added another layer of sorrow. A wallet containing family photographs, pieces of luggage with travel labels still attached, fragments of clothing. These items were gently collected, catalogued, and treated with reverence. They became the only physical connections to people who were still missing, people whose bodies had not been recovered, whose absence weighed heavily on the nation. The emotional toll on the search teams grew as the hours turned to days. No one joined the operation expecting closure to remain so elusive. No one anticipated that the lake, so large but so familiar, could hold a secret so completely. Crew members on search boats spoke quietly amongst themselves, aware that each day without discovery brought the families one step closer to a truth they were trying to avoid. By the end of the first week, it was evident that the search was moving from rescue to recovery, and soon from recovery to investigation. The chances of finding survivors had disappeared with the storm. The chances of finding major wreckage were diminishing rapidly, and the chances of uncovering the exact cause of the disaster were becoming uncertain. But one thing was undeniable. The storm had swallowed Flight 2501, and the lake was refusing to return it. Of all the tragedies that unfolded in those first days, one stood out most sharply: the realization that this was not just an aviation incident, it was a human catastrophe. 58 lives were gone, and the lake held not only the aircraft, but the stories, futures, and families tied to those lives. And the fragments washing ashore were not answers, they were reminders, haunting, painful, and incomplete. The first search attempts had revealed only one thing with certainty: the disappearance of Flight 2501 was unlike anything American aviation had faced before, and the real mystery, the question of what happened, where the aircraft was, and why so little remained, had only just begun.
In the days following the disappearance of Northwest Orient Flight 2501, Lake Michigan became the center of one of the largest and most urgent search operations in American aviation history. The storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered in the form of scattered debris, unanswered questions, and a growing sense of national grief. The lake, vast and opaque, held the aircraft somewhere beneath its surface, and the country mobilized every resource it had to find it. From the earliest hours after the plane vanished, the U.S. Coast Guard took the lead, soon joined by the U.S. Navy, state authorities, local police forces, and civilian volunteers. Their collaboration transformed the lake into a grid of human determination. Search boats fanned out across the water, maintaining formations designed to cover mileage with precision. Each vessel carried trained observers, men and women scanning the lake for clues with unbroken attention. Aircraft flew overhead, tracing the flight's suspected path in long arcs, dipping lower whenever the glint of an object or a disturbance on the water suggested something worthy of investigation. But Lake Michigan, with its unpredictable currents, shifting winds, and changing moods, was not easily navigated. Even in calm weather, the lake could swallow objects into depths that made recovery difficult. In the aftermath of a storm like the one that raged on June 23rd, the challenge became exponentially harder. The storm had torn apart the sky and lashed the water with ferocity. Turbulence in the upper atmosphere translated into chaos below the surface. Debris that might have floated for hours or days had been scattered widely across unpredictable patterns. Investigators faced a daunting reality. Without a concentrated debris field, they had no clear starting point.
They relied on radar logs, last known communications, and eyewitness reports to identify potential areas of impact. But each piece of information came with its own uncertainties. Radar in 1950 was limited, unable to track aircraft continuously or with high precision. Communications had failed mid-flight, providing no final coordinates. Witnesses along the shoreline described flashes, booms, or lights, but their accounts differed, influenced by distance and the distortions of a storm-filled night. Despite these challenges, the search operation pressed forward with unyielding determination. The U.S. Coast Guard deployed vessels equipped with sonar technology, rudimentary by today's standards, but among the most advanced available at the time. Operators sat in dimly lit rooms aboard search ships, monitoring echo patterns that bounced off the underwater landscape. They were looking for anomalies, shapes large enough, metallic enough, and distinct enough to suggest pieces of an aircraft. But the lake floor offered its own obstacles. Unlike the smooth seabeds mapped in later decades, the bottom of Lake Michigan is an uneven terrain of ridges, slopes, sandbars, and shifting sediment. Sonar signals reflected off these natural formations in ways that could mimic the contours of wreckage. Each promising reading had to be investigated by divers, and diving in the mid-20th century was a perilous endeavor, limited by visibility, depth, and the physical strain of cold, unpredictable underwater conditions. Dive teams descended into water that could drop from moderate depth to hundreds of feet within a short distance. Light disappeared quickly. Silt and sand clouded the water with every movement, reducing visibility to inches. The lake did not reveal its secrets easily. It had swallowed the aircraft silently, and now it shielded it behind a curtain of darkness and shifting earth. Meanwhile, shore patrols continued to search beaches and shallow areas where winds and currents might carry small debris. Volunteers walked miles of coastline, scanning the sand for objects that did not belong. In some places, pieces of the plane turned up days after the crash, blown inland or carried ashore by complex water movements. Each new find was cataloged carefully, photographed, and added to the growing but incomplete inventory of what the lake had surrendered. Officials established temporary command centers on shore, filled with maps, weather charts, communication equipment, and logbooks documenting every discovery. Investigators worked around the clock, reviewing storm data, analyzing possible descent trajectories, and trying to reconcile conflicting reports. The atmosphere in these rooms was solemn, intense, and charged with the knowledge that 58 lives depended on answers that remained maddeningly out of reach. Families of the passengers arrived in nearby towns, some traveling from hundreds of miles away. They gathered in quiet waiting areas, praying for any news, a piece of wreckage, a sign of survivors, an explanation. Local residents opened their homes, offering comfort to people who had been thrust into a nightmare. Clergy members visited search sites to offer support and guidance. Communities that had never before been connected to one another were now bound by shared sorrow. The emotional weight on search crews was immense. These were people accustomed to responding to emergencies, but this was different. They were not recovering a small vessel or searching for a lone missing pilot. They were searching for an entire airliner that had simply vanished. And with each passing day, the lack of progress became more difficult to reconcile. As hours turned to days and days to more than a week, frustration began to surface. The aircraft remained hidden. The lake offered no clear indication of where to look next. Visibility below the surface varied from poor to impossible, and the storm's intense violence had created conditions unlike any the search teams had previously encountered. Officials expanded the search radius again and again, covering miles of water and land. Teams used drag nets in shallower regions in hopes of snaring larger debris. Sonar suites continued, though many returned ambiguous readings. Underwater currents carried sand into trenches and across flat surfaces, potentially burying large sections of the aircraft faster than search teams could reach them. The lake's natural rhythms worked against the efforts of divers and sonar operators at every turn. The Coast Guard persisted with methodical discipline, but by the end of the second week, a painful truth was becoming undeniable. Flight 2501 had likely come to rest in a part of the lake where recovery would be near impossible with the tools available at the time. Still, the search continued, not only because the nation demanded answers, but because the families deserved them. Boats continued to cut across the water, their crews scanning waves with weary eyes. Aircraft continued to circle overhead, hoping for even the smallest clue. Investigators continued to pore over data, determined to identify the plane's final location. But Lake Michigan, deep and unyielding, resisted every attempt to uncover its secrets. Over time, the search shifted from immediate recovery to long-term investigation. Officials began collecting detailed reports, building timelines, and analyzing every fragment found. Even in the absence of a main wreckage site, they sought to reconstruct the final moments of Flight 2501 through the few clues the lake had allowed to surface. For the search teams, this shift marked a difficult transition. The urgency of rescue had faded, the urgency of discovery remained, but the hope of finding survivors or even recovering intact sections of the aircraft had all but vanished. And beneath these operational shifts was something even more profound, a growing awareness that the tragedy unfolding in Lake Michigan was not simply an accident. It was a mystery born in a storm, preserved in deep water, and expanded by every unanswered question. The crews who searched the lake carried that understanding with them each day they returned to the water. They knew they were fighting more than currents and weather. They were fighting time, depth, and the nature of the lake itself. As the massive search operation entered its final stages, one reality became clear. Flight 2501 had disappeared into one of the most unforgiving environments in North America, and Lake Michigan was not ready to give it back.
As the days stretched into weeks after the disappearance of Northwest Orient Flight 2501, the nation found itself grappling with a disturbing vacuum of information. A large commercial airliner had vanished over Lake Michigan, and despite the expansive search, the extensive manpower, and the tireless effort of investigators, the truth remained obscured beneath miles of water and layers of uncertainty. With no survivors, no major wreckage, and no final radio message explaining what went wrong, investigators were left to piece together possibilities from fragments, weather reports, and the limits of human understanding. In the face of tragedy, the mind seeks explanation. It searches for patterns, logic, reasons that can anchor grief to something tangible. But in the case of Flight 2501, every emerging theory was met with the same painful truth. Without the aircraft, none could be proven. Still, investigators were compelled to explore every avenue, not to satisfy curiosity, but to honor the lives lost and to prevent future disasters. One of the earliest theories centered on the storm itself. Meteorologists later confirmed that the system over Lake Michigan on June 23, 1950, was unusually violent, a convergence of atmospheric instability, moisture, and temperature gradients that created severe turbulence. The storm was not a single unified force, but a patchwork of powerful updrafts and dangerous downdrafts, capable of lifting an aircraft suddenly or slamming it downward with equal ferocity. For a plane flying at 3,500 feet, already lower than modern commercial cruising altitudes, these forces could have posed a significant threat. Severe downdrafts in particular became a focus of attention. Flight 2501 had requested permission to descend to 2,500 feet, citing the severity of turbulence. That request was denied because another aircraft occupied the lower altitude. Investigators later wondered whether the plane, trapped in the storm's grip, encountered a downward blast of air strong enough to rapidly reduce altitude. A sudden loss of lift, combined with reduced visibility and instrument strain, could have led to impact with the water before corrective action was possible. However, this theory, while plausible, lacked concrete evidence. No one could verify whether such a downdraft struck the DC-4 at the critical moment. The storm created an environment in which such events were likely, but likelihood is not proof. The absence of major debris prevented investigators from analyzing structural damage that might have indicated stress from extreme turbulence. Another possibility considered was structural failure. The DC-4 had a strong reputation for durability, but no aircraft is immune to mechanical limits, especially when confronted with extreme weather. Investigators reviewed maintenance records, examining the aircraft's service history. They found nothing that suggested neglect or unresolved mechanical issues. Still, the possibility that a hidden structural weakness, metal fatigue, stress on control surfaces, or compromised components contributed to the disaster could not be dismissed entirely. Yet this theory carried the same limitation as the first. Without the aircraft, structural failure remained speculative. If a wing had separated, if a tail component had malfunctioned, or if the fuselage had experienced an unseen weakness, the evidence lay somewhere beneath the lake, out of reach. Lightning was another factor investigators examined closely. The storm was electrically active, with lightning illuminating the skies throughout the region. While commercial aircraft were designed to withstand lightning strikes, the possibility of catastrophic electrical interference could not be ignored. A strike might have disabled instruments, disrupted communication systems, or startled the crew during a critical moment of flight. But again, this explanation lacked physical evidence. No known debris showed signs of electrical burns or scorching, and aircraft had survived lightning strikes before. The theory remained possible, but unverified. Investigators also considered the human factor, pilot disorientation. Flying through violent storm clouds without visibility forces pilots to trust their instruments completely. In the 1950s, instrument technology was dependable but less advanced than the systems used today. Turbulence, lightning, and intermittent radio interference could all affect cockpit judgment. Even experienced pilots could misread altitude or direction if overwhelmed by rapidly shifting conditions. But this explanation alone fell short of solving the mystery. Pilot error, if it occurred, would likely have been accompanied by an attempt to send a distress call, a message, however brief. But Flight 2501 made no such transmission. The radio fell silent without warning. Another theory examined was the possibility of fuel complications. Could the storm have caused excessive consumption, leading to a stall or engine failure? Investigators reviewed the aircraft's fuel logs and confirmed that Flight 2501 had taken off with more than enough fuel for its planned route. Engine failure during severe turbulence could have occurred, but like the other theories, there was nothing concrete to support it. Some investigators speculated whether the aircraft may have struck the lake at high speed, breaking apart instantly and scattering pieces so widely that reconstruction was impossible. The small debris fragments found, cushions, clothing, lightweight components, seemed to support a high-impact event. Larger sections may have sunk quickly or been buried in underwater sediment moved by the storm. This theory, though sobering, fit what little evidence existed. Yet the absence of substantial wreckage created another puzzle. Most water impacts leave concentrated debris fields. Why had Flight 2501 left so little behind?
The answer lay partly in the nature of Lake Michigan itself. Its depths vary dramatically, with trenches and slopes capable of pulling objects into inaccessible areas. Its currents shift unpredictably, capable of sweeping debris miles away within hours, and its sediment layers, soft and active, can conceal large objects rapidly. In many ways, the lake was an active participant in hiding the truth. Some eyewitness accounts from the shore further complicated the investigation. Residents reported hearing a loud boom late at night, possibly indicating impact or mid-air structural failure. Others described seeing a flash of red light, though lightning could have produced similar effects. A few rare accounts mentioned strange lights moving strangely above the water, but these reports were inconsistent and could not be corroborated. Investigators took every account seriously, documenting them thoroughly, but none provided the clarity needed to confirm the aircraft's final moments. Eyewitness testimony, especially during storms, is notoriously reliable. Visibility changes, sound carries differently across water, distances distort perception. What people believed they saw or heard might have been accurate, or might have been illusions shaped by weather and fear. As theories multiplied, officials faced a harsh reality. Without recovery of the main wreckage, none of these explanations could move beyond possibility. Each theory held weight, each contained logic, each could have contributed, and yet each lacked evidence strong enough to be declared definitive. This uncertainty placed investigators in an agonizing position. Their responsibility was not only to determine the cause of the disaster, but to ensure future safety. With no clear answer, they turned their focus to broader trends, weather patterns, procedural decisions, storm avoidance, and communication systems, hoping that lessons could be drawn even from incomplete understanding. The families of the victims found little comfort in theories. For them, explanations without proof felt hollow, insufficient to fill the void created by loss. They wanted answers that could be held, understood, believed, answers rooted in fact, not possibility. But the lake, protective of its depths, refused to cooperate. The investigation continued for months, but every path eventually returned to the same impasse. The aircraft was missing, and without it, truth remained beyond reach. In time, officials would issue a conclusion, one that would leave a mark on aviation history. But before that decision came, the nation had to confront the painful truth that even with diligent investigation, tireless search efforts, and scientific enquiry, some disasters resist explanation. Flight 2501 was becoming one of those disasters, a mystery shaped not by a lack of effort, but by a lack of evidence. The lake held the answers, but it was not ready to give them.
As official search teams combed Lake Michigan's waters for any sign of the missing aircraft, investigators widened their attention to the communities surrounding the lake. If Flight 2501 had gone down during the storm, someone along the shoreline might have heard or seen something, a sound, a flash, a disturbance in the night sky. Even the smallest detail could help reconstruct the aircraft's final moments. And so, quietly and carefully, investigators began interviewing residents across a broad stretch of coastline. What they uncovered was a mosaic of memories, vivid impressions shaped by fear, weather, distance, and uncertainty. These accounts, though inconsistent, formed one of the few windows into what might have taken place during those critical minutes when Flight 2501 vanished. Many residents of the lakeshore communities had gone to bed early that night, lulled in part by the rhythmic sound of rain and the booming thunder that rolled in from the west. But as the storm intensified, sleep became restless. Winds whipped through trees, rattling windows. Lightning flashed in sudden, blinding bursts, illuminating homes in pale blue light for fractions of a second before plunging everything back into darkness. The storm was the kind that demanded attention, impossible to ignore, impossible to sleep through. Sometime late that night, A number of people along the shoreline reported hearing a sudden, sharp boom echoing across the water. It was not the rolling thunder they were accustomed to. It was shorter, more abrupt, and seemed to carry a different quality, deeper, sharper, as though something large had struck a massive surface. For some who heard it, the sound was startling enough to pull them fully awake. A few even stepped outside, peering into the rain-soaked darkness, searching for the source. But the night offered nothing in return. The lake, usually visible as a reflective plane even in stormy weather, was hidden behind driving rain. The shoreline, often alive with the movement of waves, appeared as a single dark void. Everything seemed erased by the storm. Sound, sight, and distance blurred into a single tumultuous canvas. For others along the shoreline, the most memorable detail was a flash, a sudden burst of red or orange light that appeared briefly on the horizon. Lightning had already made the sky dance with illumination, but this flash seemed different. It was isolated, singular, and tinted with a color that did not resemble the cool, bluish-white blaze of lightning. It appeared for an instant and then vanished, leaving observers wondering what exactly they had witnessed. Some described this flash as faint, almost like a distant flare. Others claimed it seemed larger, illuminating a small portion of the sky before fading. But no two accounts matched precisely. Some people saw the flash through rain-blurred windows. Others glimpsed it from porches as they stepped outside to secure items in the storm. Weather distortions, the angle of view, and the limitations of human perception created variations that investigators struggled to interpret. Yet these accounts could not be ignored. They suggested that something significant had occurred over the lake at roughly the time Flight 2501 disappeared. Whether it was lightning striking the aircraft, a structural failure, or the moment of impact with the water, no one could say with certainty. But the idea that residents had witnessed the final moments of the flight, even unknowingly, gave investigators a direction, however faint. A smaller number of witnesses described something even more unusual: lights over the lake that did not behave like lightning or the lights from a vessel. These lights, according to a few reports, appeared to hover or move horizontally before disappearing. In a storm marked by electrical distortions, reflections, and cloud movement, such observations could have natural explanations, yet investigators documented them carefully, understanding that in the absence of wreckage, every detail mattered. Still, these accounts were the most inconsistent. Some witnesses reported seeing lights moving erratically. Others saw a steady glow that faded slowly. Some described colors that ranged from red to orange to white. Many admitted that the storm made it difficult to judge distance or direction. No two descriptions aligned with enough clarity to form a reliable narrative, and without corroborating evidence, these sightings remained intriguing but inconclusive. For investigators, the most useful accounts were the ones describing sound, specifically the boom that many residents heard. The timing of this boom coincided closely with the estimated window during which Flight 2501 likely struck the water. The storm's intensity, combined with the lake's vast surface, could have amplified or distorted the sound of an impact. A commercial airliner crashing into water at high speed would create a powerful shockwave that might carry farther than expected, even through heavy wind and rain. Several residents also reported noticing their homes briefly tremble or windows rattle at the moment they heard the boom. These physical sensations, though slight, indicated a disturbance strong enough to travel across the lake and make itself felt miles inland. But again, the storm complicated interpretation. Thunder itself could shake structures under certain conditions. Distinguishing between natural and unnatural forces proved nearly impossible. Throughout the interviews, investigators maintained a neutral, measured approach. Their task was not to validate or dismiss witnesses too quickly. Memory is fragile, especially shaped by fear or confusion. The storm had been intense enough to distort vision, sound, and distance. Some residents were half asleep when they heard noises. Others were fully awake but unable to see clearly through rain sheets that moved like walls. Lightning could create illusions, shadows could shift, waves could reflect light in unpredictable ways. In a world without smartphones, without video recordings, without instant communication, these verbal accounts became essential, but also inherently limited. The human testimony formed an emotional tapestry of the night, not a technical one.
Still, taken together, the witness accounts painted a picture. Something significant had happened over Lake Michigan around the time Flight 2501 disappeared. A sudden noise, a brief flash, movement of light that did not resemble lightning. These impressions matched the limited timeline available to investigators, suggesting that the aircraft encountered catastrophic conditions in the storm and met its fate swiftly. The communities along the lake grappled with their proximity to tragedy. Many residents returned to the shoreline in the days following the crash, watching search boats drift across the water. They scanned the waves themselves, feeling a sense of responsibility simply by virtue of geography. Some walked the beaches each morning, hoping to spot an item the lake had carried in overnight. These gestures reflected a quiet collective grief, a recognition that even if they had not known the passengers personally, they had witnessed a part of the tragedy no one else had seen. In newspaper interviews, some residents spoke cautiously, aware that their accounts might influence the investigation. Others shared their memories with humility, hoping that even a faint observation could help families find closure. Reporters recorded these stories with respectful tone, avoiding sensationalism. Everyone understood the gravity of the moment. The investigators assembled the witness accounts into reports, comparing them with storm data, radar data, and the timing of radio silence. But despite the effort, the accounts raised more questions than they answered. They offered glimpses, not clarity, impressions, not certainty. No eyewitness had seen the aircraft itself. No one had watched its descent. No one had observed impact. And so, the accounts became part of the mystery, valuable, haunting, and incomplete. For the families of the missing, these reports brought mixed emotions. On one hand, they suggested that the end may have come quickly and without prolonged suffering. On the other, they underscored how little was truly known, how much relied on interpretations of light and sound, distorted by one of the most violent storms of the year. In the end, the witness accounts served one critical purpose. They grounded the tragedy in human experience. They reminded investigators and the public that beneath the charts, maps, radar logs, and debris lists were people who lived through that night, people whose senses recorded fragments of the disaster as it unfolded. Fragments that, like the debris scattered across the shoreline, could not reveal the whole truth. The storm had obscured everything: sight, sound, understanding. And the lake, deep and impenetrable, continued to keep its secrets.
As the days following the disappearance of Northwest Orient Flight 2501 stretched into weeks, the tone of the search shifted from urgency to something far more difficult: desperation. In the beginning, every hour brought hope. Hope that the aircraft might be located, hope that survivors might be found, hope that the storm had not claimed all 58 lives. But as each new day ended without significant discoveries, that hope grew fragile, and Lake Michigan, silent and still, offered only fragments. Small pieces of debris continued to wash ashore: light fragments, fabric scraps, sections of seat cushions. These items were heartbreaking precisely because of what they revealed. The aircraft had broken apart with tremendous force, and the lake had swallowed most of its remains. But even with these clues, nothing pointed to a specific location. The storm had turned the lake into a shifting maze of currents, scattering pieces unpredictably across the shoreline. Then came the darkest discovery: the recovery of human remains. In the early stages of the search, a few bodies were found floating near the Michigan shoreline. These recoveries were devastating, both emotionally and scientifically, for what they implied. They confirmed that none of the passengers or crew had survived, and the condition of the remains suggested that the aircraft had impacted the water with enormous violence. Local authorities, investigators, clergy members, and medical personnel worked together to treat these remains with dignity. Families were notified privately. In an era before DNA identification, many of these identifications relied on personal effects or documentation carried by the victims. The emotional toll on the communities involved in these recoveries was heavy. Even hardened investigators felt the weight of loss as they faced the reality that the lake was beginning to return pieces of the story, but not the answers. The discovery of bodies intensified urgency.
Search crews understood that if any substantial wreckage still floated beneath the surface, time was running out before currents or decomposition buried it deeper into the lake. But the more the team searched, the more the lake resisted. As debris continued to be found, aviation experts attempted to reconstruct the aircraft's breakup pattern, but the fragments were too few and too scattered. Without larger sections of fuselage or mechanical components, investigators could not determine the sequence of structural failure, if it was structural failure at all. Everything that surfaced was light in weight, easily carried by waves: fabric, insulation, personal belongings. Items that told stories of lives, but not of mechanisms or metal. Despite the grim discoveries, the main wreckage remained elusive. The Navy, Coast Guard, and civilian vessels expanded their search area repeatedly. Boats traveled in strict grid formations, scanning the water with binoculars and sonar. Pilots in search planes flew so many hours that some began to memorize the contours of the lake from above. The search radius grew to cover dozens of square miles, but every potential lead dissolved into the same unacceptable conclusion: nothing substantial had been found. Underwater diving operations, though determined, were hampered by the lake's depth and conditions. Divers descended into cold, murky water where visibility at times shrank to less than a foot. Lake Michigan, even in calm weather, is notoriously difficult to navigate below the surface. In areas where trenches or ridges plunge sharply, underwater currents can push debris into inaccessible pockets. Sand and silt settle quickly, erasing evidence in layers that accumulate faster than divers can uncover. The divers returned from each descent with the same report: nothing. No fuselage, no engines, no recognizable structure of an aircraft. Meanwhile, pressure mounted on investigators. Families demanded answers. Airline officials needed clarity to prevent future tragedies. The public followed each update with a mixture of fear and disbelief. How could an aircraft that size, nearly 100 feet long, weighing tens of thousands of pounds, simply vanish? The question echoed through homes, offices, newsrooms, and government halls. The search grew more emotionally charged as people began to realize that the lake might never reveal its secret. And yet, no one was willing to give up. To stop searching would mean accepting that the mystery might never be solved, an outcome many were not prepared to face. In the midst of the operation, state and federal agencies gathered every possible piece of information. They interviewed witnesses repeatedly. They studied weather charts. They cross-referenced radar logs, re-examined the flight path, and consulted meteorologists about storm behavior. But without physical evidence, each line of inquiry stalled. The more investigators learned, the more the mystery deepened. The storm had been fierce, but not unprecedented. The aircraft was old by modern standards, but reliable for its time. The pilot was experienced, his crew competent. The plane had no recorded mechanical issues prior to departure. The flight had not reported significant trouble until the request to descend. Why, then, had the outcome been so catastrophic? Desperation brought renewed attempts. Sonar sweeps became more frequent. New grids were established. Ships were deployed farther north, farther south, and deeper into the center of the lake. Some believed the aircraft might have drifted beneath the water before sinking. Others believed that the storm had torn it apart mid-air, scattering components over a vast area. Still others considered that debris might have been pushed down into underwater ravines the technology of the time could not penetrate. Despite these efforts, no major wreckage was found. As weeks turned into months, the emotional toll on search crews became evident. Many had been involved since the first hours of the disappearance. They had worked through exhaustion, through unpredictable weather, through emotional strain. They had met the families of the victims. They had walked the beaches where personal belongings washed ashore. They had seen the weight of grief on the faces of those waiting for answers. Yet every morning they returned to the lake, not because they expected to find a miracle, but because they could not accept leaving the story incomplete. The search area continued to expand until it stretched beyond what most considered reasonable.
At times, boats traversed the lake at distances so far from the suspected crash zone that even seasoned sailors questioned the likelihood of success. But desperation can stretch boundaries. Hope can widen search grids. Determination can push logic farther than expected. At the same time, investigators faced logistical constraints. Resources could not remain deployed indefinitely. The search was costly, complex, and required coordination between multiple agencies. Every extension required justification. Every new plan required approval. Each day without discovery made those approvals harder to justify. Privately, some investigators admitted what no one wanted to say publicly. The lake may have buried the aircraft beyond recovery. Eventually, officials had to acknowledge that the likelihood of finding substantial wreckage was diminishing. As summer progressed, the lake grew more busy with civilian boat traffic. Weather conditions shifted again. The window for effective underwater searching narrowed. The sands beneath the lake continued to shift with each passing week, potentially covering any wreckage deeper and deeper. By late summer, the search efforts began to wind down. Not because the investigators lacked commitment, but because the lake had defeated every method available at the time. The transition from active search to formal investigation was one of the most painful steps in the entire process. Crews, investigators, and families confronted a reality no one wanted. The aircraft might never be found, and the exact circumstances of the disaster might remain unknown forever. Desperation yielded no answers. Exhaustive searching brought only fragments, and Lake Michigan, despite the relentless human effort, held its silence. Yet, the investigation was far from over. If the lake would not reveal the truth would have to be assembled from what remained above the surface: data, fragments, testimony, and analysis.
The search had reached its limits. Now, it was time for investigators to face the impossible task of reconstructing a story without its greatest source of evidence. When the search for Northwest Orient Flight 2501 yielded no major wreckage, investigators from the Civil Aeronautics Board, the CAB, faced a task unlike any other in mid-century aviation. They were responsible for determining the cause of a disaster without the most essential element of evidence, the aircraft itself. No engines, no cockpit, no instrumentation, no tail assembly, nothing that normally guides accident analysis, just fragments, weather reports, scattered witness accounts, and the weight of 58 lives lost. The investigation began with the same meticulous structure used for all aviation incidents of the era. Data was collected, cataloged, analyzed. But from the start, the CAB confronted barriers that felt insurmountable. Every known method of reconstructing an accident relied on physical evidence, and in the case of Flight 2501, nearly all physical evidence rested somewhere deep beneath Lake Michigan, inaccessible, invisible, silent. Still, the CAB approached their work with rigorous discipline. They began by studying the flight plan, reviewing weather conditions, and examining the aircraft's performance history. Maintenance logs were analyzed, crew records were evaluated. An extensive review of meteorological charts confirmed the violence of the storm system that had swept over the region on June 23, 1950. The storm was not just severe, it was anomalous. Turbulence readings from nearby aircraft revealed pockets of extreme instability. Meteorologists described vertical air movements capable of pushing an aircraft upward hundreds of feet in seconds or dragging it downward with equal speed. The storm combined multiple destructive elements: heavy rain, lightning, strong winds, and erratic downdrafts known to disorient even experienced pilots. This weather data immediately emerged as a central factor in the investigation. The crew's request to descend from 3,500 to 2,500 feet signaled their struggle to maintain stable flight through increasingly dangerous conditions. The denial of that request, though consistent with air traffic procedures, meant the aircraft remained in an altitude band heavily affected by turbulence and storm activity. The CAB recognized that the flight had been flying into atmospheric conditions far more threatening than originally forecast. But weather alone did not explain everything. Investigators needed to consider the possibility of mechanical failure. They examined the DC-4's maintenance history, which revealed no outstanding mechanical issues at the time of departure. The aircraft had been cleared for flight after standard inspections. The engines were reliable models with proven track records. The crew was qualified and experienced. Yet mechanical failure remained on the table because without the aircraft, it could not be ruled out. Structural fatigue, hidden flaws, or sudden component failure could theoretically have occurred, but in the absence of large debris pieces showing metal stress or fracture patterns, investigators could not move beyond possibility into fact. Electrical interference and lightning strikes were also evaluated. Thunderstorms over large bodies of water are notorious for generating electrical fields capable of disrupting radios and instruments. The weakening and eventual loss of radio communication with Flight 2501 raised questions about whether lightning or atmospheric static had played a role. But again, without the wreckage, the CAB could not verify these effects. Pilot disorientation was another theory examined. Flying over water at night removes the visual horizon, a primary reference point for pilots. In 1950, cockpit instruments were dependable but more limited than today. When heavy turbulence, strong winds, and electrical disruptions are layered onto an already disorienting environment, even a skilled crew can struggle to maintain perfect situational awareness. The CAB acknowledged this possibility, but it remained one piece of a larger uncertainty. The investigation also examined the aircraft's weight and load distribution. Flight 2501 was carrying 55 passengers and 3 crew members, a full manifest. Records showed the aircraft was within maximum weight limits, but investigators considered whether its load might have affected handling in a storm of such severity. Ultimately, the data did not support overloading or improper balance as contributing factors. During their analysis, the CAB also considered the few personal items and body fragments recovered from the lake. These items did not show signs of fire, prolonged flotation, or mid-air explosion. Their condition suggested a high-impact collision with the water. But the absence of larger debris prevented determination of whether the aircraft had broken apart before impact, during impact, or immediately after entering the water. This distinction mattered greatly. If the aircraft broke apart in the air, the cause could point towards structural failure or extreme atmospheric pressure. If it remained intact until impact, then the storm's downward forces or loss of control might have been primarily responsible. But the lake, having swallowed the aircraft whole, offered no clarity. The CAB also struggled with the lack of a complete and consistent witness narrative. The boom heard by residents could have signaled impact or simply thunder. The brief red flash might have been lightning illuminating moisture in the air. The strange lights, some reported, likely atmospheric reflections or distortions caused by the storm. Without corroboration, none of these accounts provided usable evidence. Deeper investigators went, the more they realized they were reconstructing the edges of a story, but not its center. Every theory had merit, every possibility carried logic, but none could be verified. Flight 2501 existed in a space between known and unknown, between analysis and absence. Months passed, reports multiplied, charts and diagrams covered investigators' desks, and yet the essential questions remained unanswered. What happened in the minutes after the pilot's final transmission? Why did the aircraft descend into the lake? Why did no distress call follow? What forces acted upon the aircraft that night? And why did the lake refuse to reveal the answers? The CAB re-evaluated every angle.
At times, they revisited earlier theories, searching for something they might have missed. At other times, they scrutinized environmental data again, hoping patterns might emerge. They studied aircraft performance characteristics under storm conditions. They examined reports from pilots who flew similar routes that night. They cross-referenced weather anomalies with radar logs. Nothing offered the breakthrough they needed. In the absence of evidence, the final report approached completion with a painful understanding. This investigation would end without resolution. In the history of American aviation, such conclusions are rare. Even in early flight eras, most accidents left behind enough wreckage to identify probable causes. But Flight 2501 defied the norms of accident analysis. The lake had taken the evidence, and without evidence, truth remained out of reach. When the Civil Aeronautics Board released its final report, it reflected this reality with stark honesty. The probable cause of the crash of Northwest Orient Flight 2501 is unknown. These words, simple, devastating, unprecedented, marked the culmination of months of analysis and thousands of hours of effort. They carried weight not only for investigators, but for aviation history. A commercial aircraft had vanished in a modern age, leaving behind only fragments and questions. For the families of the victims, the report was agonizing. They had waited for answers that would explain with certainty why their loved ones had never returned. Instead, they received a conclusion that acknowledged the limits of human knowledge and the power of nature to erase truth. But the report also carried implications for aviation safety. Even without identifying a single definitive cause, the investigation highlighted vulnerabilities in weather forecasting, communication systems, and flight protocols. These insights spurred improvements in weather tracking, pilot training, and incident response coordination. In that sense, the tragedy influenced a safer future, even as its own causes remained hidden. Still, the unresolved nature of Flight 2501's fate cast a long shadow over the aviation community. A mystery of this magnitude was not supposed to be possible, and yet it happened. A modern aircraft, flying a routine route, had disappeared without leaving behind a trace large enough to explain its loss. In the end, the investigation reached a solemn acceptance. The truth was in the lake, and the lake had claimed it. The CAB could document the storm, calculate possible descent paths, evaluate theories, and acknowledge limitations, but it could not lift the aircraft from where it lay. It could not overcome the silence of the deep. Flight 2501 became officially and permanently one of American aviation's great enigmas, a case where the line between fact and finality dissolved into the depths of Lake Michigan.
Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of tragedy, but it seldom erases them. For the families of the 58 souls lost aboard Northwest Orient Flight 2501, the wound never fully healed. And as the decades passed, the lake continued to guard its secret in silence. The official investigation had ended, the nation had moved on, but the mystery remained, vast, unresolved, and enduring. By the early 2000s, more than half a century had passed since the plane vanished. Aviation had transformed in unimaginable ways. Jets now crossed oceans in hours. GPS navigation and satellite weather systems had replaced the guesswork of mid-century flight planning. Black box recorders, absent in 1950, had become standard. Modern radar could track aircraft with pinpoint accuracy. In that transformed landscape, Flight 2501 seemed like a relic of a distant era, a tragic reminder of the limitations once faced in aviation's adolescence. But even as technology changed, one question lingered. Could modern tools finally reveal what Lake Michigan had hidden for so long? The answer came not from a federal agency, but from a group of dedicated researchers and shipwreck hunters, the Michigan Shipwreck Research Association, known as MSRA.
Fascinated by the lake's history and driven by the enduring mystery of Flight 2501, they began a new chapter of the search. With advancements in sonar mapping, underwater imaging, and precise navigation systems, they believed the time had come to look again. The MSRA team understood that the task before them was monumental. Dozens of search attempts had failed before. The lake was deep, unpredictable, and ever-changing. Sand shifts across its floor like dunes in a desert, burying objects and uncovering others. Currents move debris along invisible pathways. Storms reshape the underwater landscape entirely. And the lake's size alone, vast, cold, and unfathomably complex, made the challenge daunting. But these modern searchers carried something earlier teams had not, an unshakable resolve to find what the lake had concealed, combined with tools capable of seeing farther and deeper than any technology available in 1950. Their search began in 2004, more than 50 years after Flight 2501 disappeared. Using side-scan sonar, they mapped sections of the lake floor systematically, scanning for shapes that might indicate wreckage. Sonar imagery, though not as precise as photography, allows searchers to identify anomalies, objects resting on the floor that do not belong to the natural environment. The process is slow, meticulous, and often frustrating. The first year passed with no results. But the MSRA team was not discouraged. They expanded their search grid, they refined sonar techniques, they consulted archival materials, re-examined weather maps, and considered the drift patterns of debris found in 1950. They spoke with historians, meteorologists, and aviation experts. Each year they returned to the lake with more data and stronger determination. During these searches, a pattern began to emerge, not of aircraft wreckage, but of shipwrecks. The depths of Lake Michigan are a graveyard of vessels lost over centuries, and many of them had never been documented. As the search teams scanned the lake, they discovered one shipwreck after another: wooden schooners from the 1800s, steel freighters from the early 20th century, barges lost during storms long forgotten. Each discovery was a reminder that the lake holds more than secrets, it holds history. But none of these discoveries brought them closer to Flight 2501. In 2005, hope flickered for a moment when sonar detected a large object buried under layers of sand. Divers prepared to descend, but when they reached the site, the truth was clear. It was another shipwreck, not the missing plane. Though disappointed, the team pressed on. Another sonar reading appeared promising in 2006, an anomaly with a shape unlike the wooden vessels previously found. Again, divers descended. Again, it was not the aircraft. Time and sediment had disguised the shapes of many objects underwater, creating illusions that sonar alone could not interpret accurately. Still, the MSRA team refused to abandon the search. They understood that persistence was the only way forward. Modern technology offered access the original investigators never had, but even the best equipment could not overcome the complexity of the lake without patient, repeated effort. In 2008, the teams expanded their collaboration with archaeologists and other researchers who specialized in underwater surveys. Access to more sophisticated sonar equipment allowed them to re-scan areas previously examined. Each pass provided clearer images, sharper outlines, more refined data. Slowly, the lake floor revealed more of itself: ridges, drop-offs, trenches, fields of sediment, but never the unmistakable signature of a downed aircraft. What made the search most challenging was the nature of Flight 2501's likely impact. If the aircraft had struck the lake with tremendous force, as evidence suggested, the resulting breakup may have scattered pieces widely over the lake floor. Portions of the fuselage may have crumpled into shapes indistinguishable from natural formations. Engines, though heavy, could have plunged into deeper pockets, obscured by silt. Wings and tail sections could have broken apart and drifted far from the initial impact site. In 2013, sonar detected another large anomaly. Divers once again suited up and descended into the lake's frigid depths. The water was murky. Visibility was minimal. Beneath layers of sediment lay the object, long, metallic, promising. But upon closer inspection, it became clear. It was not an aircraft. It was a long-lost shipping barge buried under decades of underwater silt. Year after year, the search continued, and year after year, the lake offered history, but not the answer that researchers sought. MSRA documented dozens of shipwrecks, enriching the historical understanding of the Great Lakes, but the one wreck they sought most remained hidden. Why, even with modern technology, did Flight 2501 remain undiscovered? Part of the answer lies in the very nature of Lake Michigan. Unlike the ocean floor, which is mostly stable rock, the lake bed is composed of soft sediment, sand, clay, silt, that moves continually. Storms churn these layers, shifting them across the lake floor and burying objects with remarkable speed. A large piece of metal can become submerged under several feet of silt within months, and after decades could be entirely entombed. Another factor is depth. Some areas of the lake reach depths of more than 900 feet. Even areas believed to be shallower near the probable crash zone can drop off suddenly into underwater ravines. Early sonar equipment was not capable of accurately scanning these deeper, uneven regions. Even modern systems struggle with the lake's variable terrain. Currents further complicate the search. Unlike rivers, which flow predictably in one direction, lake currents can shift based on temperature, wind, storm activity, and seasonal changes. In 1950, the storm that consumed Flight 2501 created chaotic currents, capable of dragging debris in multiple directions simultaneously. What sank near the crash zone may have traveled far across the lake floor. In interviews, MSRA researchers expressed both frustration and respect. Frustration because they believed the truth about Flight 2501 must be somewhere beneath them, waiting. Respect because they recognized the lake's immense power, its ability to preserve history, conceal tragedy, and control the narrative of what can and cannot be known. Despite decades of effort, the renewed searches did not uncover the aircraft, but they did accomplish something profoundly important. They kept the story alive. They demonstrated enduring commitment to uncovering a truth that had eluded generations. They proved that even when odds are overwhelming, mysteries are worth pursuing. Flight 2501 remains undiscovered, not because of lack of effort, but because of a lake whose depths hold secrets as vast as its waters. And yet, the story did not end with the failure to locate wreckage. The searches of the 2000s became a bridge between past and present, connecting the tragedy of 1950 with the ongoing quest for answers. In that connection, the memory of the 58 lost lives continued to be honored. Not forgotten, not abandoned, still calling out across decades of silence.
For most of America, the disappearance of Northwest Orient Flight 2501 gradually became a headline of the past, a mystery acknowledged, a tragedy remembered, but one that faded from national attention as time marched on. But for the families of the 55 passengers and 3 crew members, time did not bring distance. It did not close the wound. It did not soften the loss. Instead, it created a kind of suspended grief, a sorrow without finality, a question without an answer, an absence that felt just as sharp decades later as it did on the night the plane vanished. When a loved one dies and a body is recovered, grief takes a known shape. There is mourning, ceremony, burial, remembrance. There is a final acknowledgement, painful but complete, that allows families to begin carrying their loss in a different way. But when a loved one disappears without a trace, grief becomes something else entirely. It becomes a shadow that stretches across years, sometimes across generations. It becomes a story told in fragments,
a waiting that never fully ends. For the families of Flight 2501, the absence of certainty defined their lives long after the storm passed. In the first days after the disappearance, families clung to hope. They waited near telephones, praying for a miracle, for news of survivors, for any sign that the aircraft had landed somewhere unexpectedly. When debris began washing ashore, that hope faltered but did not vanish. Many families believed that bodies or wreckage might be found, that the truth, however devastating, would become clear. But as the weeks turned into months and months into years, the truth remained buried beneath the surface of Lake Michigan. The recoveries of a few remains in 1950 confirmed the loss of life, but they did not provide closure. The majority of the victims were never recovered. Their final resting place remained unknown. Their absence remained unresolved. Families returned to daily life because life demanded it, but the uncertainty traveled with them. Parents lost sons and daughters. Children grew up without mothers or fathers. Spouses built new futures while carrying the weight of unanswered questions. Siblings aged while still wondering what exactly had happened to the people who once shared their childhoods. Photographs became anchors, faces frozen in time, untouched by the years that followed. Letters written days before the flight became treasured artifacts. Suitcases that had never arrived at their destination sat untouched in airline offices before eventually being returned. Some families kept those suitcases sealed for the rest of their lives, unable to face the emotional impact of opening them. For many, the disappearance shaped their understanding of loss itself. It became a reminder that life can vanish in moments, that answers are not guaranteed, and that closure is sometimes a luxury the world cannot give. In the decades that followed, families continued to ask questions. Some wrote letters to federal agencies, others contacted the airline. A few traveled to Michigan, visiting the shoreline where debris had washed ashore. They stood on the same sand where fragments of their loved ones' lives had appeared years before, staring out at the lake's horizon, that silent expanse that swallowed answers and never returned them. Some families passed their grief down to the next generation. Children who had been too young to understand the tragedy grew into adults who inherited not only their parents' memories, but their unanswered questions. Grandchildren learned the story through family narratives, carrying forward a legacy of loss they had never personally experienced. The mystery became part of family identity, a story whispered at gatherings, retold on anniversaries, revisited whenever the lake was mentioned in conversation. Time did not erase the tragedy, it preserved it. Every few years, newspapers would publish anniversary articles. Reporters would interview surviving relatives. The public would remember briefly, then move on again. But the families never moved on. Not truly, because moving on requires closure, and closure requires knowledge. For some, participation in renewed searches during the 2000s brought a renewed sense of purpose. They connected with the Michigan Shipwreck Research Association, offering photographs, documents, and emotional support. They attended meetings, read reports, followed sonar updates, and waited for the phone call that would finally say, "We found it." That call never came. Still, the searches meant something. They represented effort, a refusal to let the victims fade into obscurity. The families took comfort in knowing that someone was still looking, that the story had not been abandoned to the past, that their loved ones were not forgotten. Memorials played a deeply meaningful role. In South Haven, Michigan, where much of the debris came ashore, a memorial was eventually established to honor the passengers and crew of Flight 2501. Families traveled from across the country to attend ceremonies, standing before engraved names that recognized each life lost. The memorial brought people together, strangers connected by tragedy, and offered a place to grieve collectively, a place where absence could be acknowledged openly. For families who had spent decades without a grave to visit, the memorial became a symbolic resting place, a location where they could mourn, speak their loved ones' names, leave flowers, and feel a sense of connection to a tragedy that had always been painfully intangible. Some family members kept journals, reflecting on their grief year after year.
Others saved newspaper clippings, assembling scrapbooks that captured both the tragedy and the ongoing search for answers. These personal archives became testaments to resilience, evidence that the passage of time had not erased their determination to remember. Throughout all of this, the emotional burden remained heavy. Survivors described the disappearance as something they learned to carry, not something they overcame. Many spoke of the strange duality created by the lack of physical evidence. Their loved ones were gone, but there was no definitive ending, no last moment witnessed, no wreckage identified, no remains buried, just a vast lake and a silence that stretched across generations. For some, the grief became intertwined with guilt, the quiet, unspoken sorrow of those who survived because they weren't on that flight. A meeting postponed, a ticket changed, a last-minute cancellation. These small decisions created lifelong questions about fate, chance, and what might have been. Others clung to hope longer than they admitted. Even decades later, a part of them believed that someday the aircraft would be found, that a discovery would provide the missing piece, that the mystery would no longer be a haunting, open-ended story. But even as searches improved and sonar mapping became more advanced, the lake held firm. It revealed nothing large, nothing definitive, nothing that could bring closure. In the face of this uncertainty, families turned to each other. They formed connections across state lines, sharing memories of those they had lost. They wrote letters to each other. They attended memorial events. They created informal networks of remembrance. Their unity became a quiet force, an expression of love, grief, and determination that outlasted the tragedy itself. And through all of this, one truth became clear. The story of Flight 2501 was not just about aviation. It was not just about weather or technology or search operations. It was about people, about families shattered, futures altered, and generations shaped by the absence of answers. The passengers and crew of Flight 2501 lived full lives before they stepped onto that aircraft. They laughed, worked, dreamed, argued, planned, loved. Their lives were not defined by the tragedy that claimed them, but the tragedy did define the lives of those they left behind. And even decades later, long after the storm had passed, the lake continued to echo with the unanswered questions of families who never stopped searching, not just for wreckage, but for understanding, meaning, and peace.
In the decades that followed the disappearance of Northwest Orient Flight 2501, the mystery surrounding its fate did not fade. Instead, it grew into something larger than the event itself, a symbol of the limits of human knowledge, a reminder of nature's unpredictable power, and a defining chapter in the evolution of American aviation safety. What began as a tragic loss on a stormy night in 1950 became one of the most enduring enigmas in the history of flight. When people first heard the news, a commercial airliner vanished without warning, without a final call, without a trace. Disbelief was the overwhelming response. Aviation was supposed to be modern, controlled, and scientifically advanced. The public trusted it because it represented progress. Yet here was a reminder that progress does not equal perfection. Machines fail, weather overwhelms, nature asserts itself, and sometimes, despite all human effort, the truth remains hidden. From its earliest days, Flight 2501 occupied a unique place in American consciousness. Unlike other air tragedies of the era, this one offered no clear narrative. There was no wreckage to reconstruct, no survivors to recount the final moments, no definitive evidence to confirm what had happened. The aircraft simply vanished. And in a nation From its earliest days, Flight 2501 occupied a unique place in American consciousness. Unlike other air tragedies of the era, this one offered no clear narrative. There was no wreckage to reconstruct, no survivors to recount the final moments, no definitive evidence to confirm what had happened. The aircraft simply vanished. And in a nation accustomed to answers, scientific answers, procedural answers, mechanical answers, that absence created a profound unease.
But the lasting legacy of Flight 2501 is not rooted only in mystery. It is also rooted in transformation. The disappearance forced aviation officials, meteorologists, and air traffic regulators to confront the vulnerabilities revealed by the tragedy. Though the Civil Aeronautics Board concluded that the probable cause was unknown, the investigation illuminated broader issues that demanded attention. One of those issues was weather forecasting. In 1950, meteorological data was limited. Weather stations were scattered, radar technology was primitive, and severe storms could develop faster than prediction models could detect. Pilots relied heavily on experience and incomplete data. The storm over Lake Michigan that night demonstrated how quickly conditions could escalate, creating environments in which aircraft were placed at significant risk. In the years that followed, aviation weather forecasting advanced dramatically. New radar installations were built, storm tracking techniques improved, meteorologists gained better tools to analyze atmospheric instability. Airlines implemented stricter protocols for severe weather avoidance, reducing the likelihood that aircraft would be routed through dangerous storm systems. While these advances cannot be credited to Flight 2501 alone, the tragedy contributed to the urgency that fueled change. Communication systems also evolved. The inability of Flight 2501 to maintain clear radio contact during the storm highlighted the fragility of mid-century communication technology. Atmospheric interference, electrical activity, and equipment limitations all played roles in weakening transmissions. Modern systems now incorporate redundancies and fail-safes that reduce the risk of losing communication entirely. Digital systems replaced analog ones. Satellite-based networks provide connections unaffected by many of the atmospheric conditions that hindered communication that night. Air traffic control procedures changed as well. In 1950, airspace management was constrained by limited radar coverage and less precise altitude tracking. Today, aircraft move through carefully monitored corridors with strict separation requirements and sophisticated radar surveillance. Had these systems existed in 1950, the situation that prevented Flight 2501 from descending might have been handled differently. Modern controlled descents, real-time tracking, and automated alerts reduce the likelihood of collisions and improve decision-making under pressure. Pilot training and cockpit instrumentation also evolved. The disappearance of Flight 2501 underscored the challenges pilots faced when flying blind through turbulence and storm clouds. This led to improvements in instrument reliability, cross-check procedures, and training for spatial disorientation scenarios. Enhanced cockpit displays, computerized navigation, and weather radar now give pilots information that was unimaginable in 1950. In this way, Flight 2501 occupies a place in aviation history not only as a tragedy, but as a catalyst, part of the larger narrative that shaped safety standards still used today. Yet for all the scientific and procedural advancements that followed, the emotional impact of the disappearance remained as raw as ever. For families, Flight 2501 was not a symbol or a case study, it was personal. It represented people they loved, people whose stories stopped suddenly in the middle of an ordinary night. And for them, the mystery brought anguish that could not be solved by policy changes or improved technology. Still, they found ways to honor those lost. They built memorials, they attended commemorations, they passed the stories down through generations. And as the decades unfolded, the tragedy became a part of local history, especially in the communities along the Michigan shoreline, where fragments of the plane washed ashore in the days after the crash. For the wider American public, Flight 2501 became a story retold whenever conversations turned about vanished aircraft, a precursor to the modern fascination with aviation mysteries. In documentaries, articles, and historical accounts, the case resurfaced again and again as one of the earliest examples of a large commercial airliner disappearing in the United States. What made the mystery so enduring was not simply the lack of answers, it was the scale of the loss. 58 people does not represent a statistic, it represents 58 individual worlds. Mothers, fathers, children, workers, soldiers, friends, each with futures imagined and abruptly erased. And because their final moments remain unknown, the tragedy carries a deeper resonance, one shaped not only by sorrow, but narrative silence. When historians reflect on Flight 2501, they often describe it as a turning point, a moment when America realized that air travel, as promising as it was, carried risks beyond human control. It was a reminder that the sky, like the sea, could keep secrets. It was a reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, must always grapple with the unpredictable force of nature. And it was a reminder that humanity's reach, even in its most ambitious moments, has limits. Despite all this, the search for answers did not end with the mid-century investigation. The renewed efforts in the 2000s created a bridge between past and present, proving that some mysteries never lose their pull. The desire for truth did not diminish with time, it deepened. Modern researchers brought science, passion, and persistence, yet even they were humbled by the lake's ability to conceal. Lake Michigan, in its vastness, stands as a physical symbol of the unanswered questions that define this tragedy. It is a body of water capable of beauty and violence, calm and chaos, a mirror of the world that swallowed Flight 2501. And just as the lake refused to surrender the wreckage, it refused to surrender the story's ending. That unresolved quality is what cements Flight 2501's place in aviation history, not as an isolated incident, not as a cautionary tale alone, but as a testament to the complexities of flight, the power of nature, and the enduring human need to understand. Some aviation mysteries are solved quickly, others are solved decades later, but some remain suspended in a space between fact and memory, stories that continue to echo long after the final radio transmission goes silent. Flight 2501 is one of those stories. Its disappearance reshaped aviation safety. Its absence haunts investigators. Its memory endures in the lives of families, and its unanswered questions continue to captivate anyone who hears them. In a world driven by data, technology, and relentless pursuit of knowledge, the case stands as a reminder that not every truth can be uncovered, that some stories belong partly to history, partly to science, and partly to the silence of the natural world. And in that silence, the mystery lives on.
In the 75 years since Northwest Orient Flight 2501 vanished into the darkness above Lake Michigan, the story has lingered in a space that few tragedies occupy, a place between history and myth, between fact and the unknowable, between the world we understand and the one that refuses to be fully revealed. For the families, for the investigators, for the searchers who spent decades scanning the lake floor, the disappearance is not just a case, it is a presence, a weight, a silence that endures. And even now, in 2025, as technology transforms our world with each passing year, the lake remains as impenetrable as it was on the night of June 23, 1950. Machines can map the ocean floor with satellite precision. Artificial intelligence can reconstruct events with mathematical fidelity. Autonomous vehicles can descend into the deepest trenches of the world's oceans. Yet Lake Michigan, one body of water, bordered by bustling cities, watched daily by thousands, still keeps its secret. The disappearance of Flight 2501 is a reminder that even in an age of unprecedented knowledge, mystery is not extinct. Nature still holds the power to erase, to conceal, to silence,
And sometimes, despite our greatest efforts, the truth remains just beyond the reach of our machines, our tools, and our determination. For the 58 people aboard the flight, the world stopped on that stormy night. Their lives were full of purpose, full of relationships, full of dreams waiting to unfold. They were traveling toward homes and reunions, toward work and opportunity, toward the simple expectation of tomorrow. Their absence left gaps that no investigation, no memorial, and no passage of time could ever fully bridge. Yet their stories did not end with their disappearance. They live on in the memories of families who never stopped hoping for answers, in the efforts of researchers who dedicated years of their lives to searching the lake, and in the legacy of aviation standards transformed by the questions this case forced the industry to confront. The storm that consumed Flight 2501 has long since passed. The waves that churned violently that night have risen and fallen millions of times since. The shoreline where fragments washed up has been reshaped by seasons, storms, and time. Children born that year grew old, cities expanded, technology evolved, and yet the lake remains unchanged in one profound way. It has told us nothing more about what happened. It stands as a still witness to an invisible event, an event no one saw directly, no one recorded, no one could reconstruct. The lake knows, but the lake does not speak. When people visit the memorial in South Haven, they often remark on the quiet, the rustle of leaves, the hum of the wind, the distant wash of waves against the shore. And beneath that quiet lies something deeper, a sense of unresolved history, a feeling that the names etched in granite represent stories still unfinished. Visitors read the names, they touch the engraved letters, they stand before the memorial that exists because a plane that should have been found was never found. Some bring flowers, some bring photographs, some bring questions no one can answer. The memorial is more than a place of remembrance. It is a promise that those aboard Flight 2501 will not be forgotten, even if their final resting place remains hidden beneath the waves. And in a way, the memorial also acknowledges something profound, that closure does not always come from answers. Sometimes closure comes from remembering, from honoring, from refusing to let silence erase lives. In this way, the legacy of Flight 2501 is not defined by its mystery, but by the insistence that the people aboard it continue to matter. Their memory lives in every article written about the case, every documentary produced, every researcher who takes a boat onto Lake Michigan searching for debris, every historian who writes another chapter about mid-century aviation, every family member who tells the next generation about the loved one they lost. Their memory lives in the evolution of aviation safety, in the weather monitoring systems that protect passengers today, in the improved communication networks that ensure no aircraft goes untracked across American skies. Even though their plane vanished, the lessons drawn from the tragedy helped protect countless lives afterward. And their memory lives in the lake itself, in the idea that something so vast and familiar can contain mysteries powerful enough to shape history. People often ask why the disappearance of Flight 2501 continues to resonate so deeply after so many decades. The answer is not just the scale of the tragedy, nor the silence of the lake, nor the absence of answers. It is the human desire to understand, to piece together what happened, to imagine the final moments, to fill the void left by uncertainty. But sometimes, the world reminds us that answers are not guaranteed, that even with all our science and skill, some truths remain hidden. And perhaps that is why this case endures, because it forces us to confront the limits of knowledge and the fragility of life. In the years after the disappearance, pilots crossed Lake Michigan countless times. They looked down and saw open water, calm and unbroken. But beneath that calm lies a story,
one that begins with a storm, a vanishing aircraft, and 58 lives enter in history through absence rather than discovery. Investigators, divers, sonar technicians, and historians searched for the wreckage with everything available to them. They sought closure not only for the families, but for aviation itself, for the sense of order that flight depends on. Yet the lake resisted. Year after year, search after search, innovation after innovation, the vast floor of Lake Michigan revealed only shipwrecks, sand formations, and silence. The truth, still hiding after 70 years, has become part of the case's identity, part of its legacy, part of its power. And so, our understanding of Flight 2501 remains incomplete, not because we failed to look hard enough, but because some forces are stronger than our ability to illuminate them. Nature does not always yield its secrets. Some stories remain sealed beneath layers of water, sediment, and time. But while the truth remains hidden, remembrance does not. Every anniversary, families still speak their loved ones' names. Researchers still revisit the data. Documentarians retell the story. Historians analyze the case anew. And each retelling becomes a way of keeping the passengers and crew alive, a way of refusing to let them vanish entirely. Because the true legacy of Flight 2501 is not the wreckage still missing. It is the memory still present. It is the resilience of families who lived decades with unanswered questions. It is the perseverance of searchers who returned to the lake again and again. It is the transformation of aviation safety shaped by lessons learned from loss. It is a reminder that every mystery holds human lives at its center. Today, we stand in a world more advanced than the one that existed in 1950. The skies are safer, weather predictions are sharper, communication is stronger. But the story of Flight 2501 remains a quiet pulse under all that progress. A reminder that the sky, for all its promise, demands respect, vigilance, and humility. And as long as the lake continues to guard its secret, the story of Flight 2501 will continue to echo across generations, not as a closed chapter, but as a